Alright, so I'm going to be talking about the history of the proceedings leading up to the DSM and the results of the DSM-1 releasing. So one thing people might not realize is that the Bureau of the Census specifically in 1910 and 1912, I believe, the American Medico-Psychological Association assisted the Bureau of the Census in collecting data on if people were idiots, imbeciles, like if they were seen to be clinically insane. It was typically people that were more in like hospital situations that were considered clinically insane due to the fact that outpatient wasn't super like popular at the time or really even around much. But eventually the American Medico-Psychological Association determined that the measure of the census was not good enough because it didn't really do a good job of like classifying people into different disorders and stuff like that. So the American Medico-Psychological Association, or what we know now as the American Psychiatric Association, because their name changed in the early 1900s, so they felt that helping the census collect data was actually discrediting the science of psychology, and they also felt that there should be more reliability between professionals, and there wasn't really at the time. And they became very interested in psychiatric nosology. So this is more the course of the illness rather than the individual and like their own personality and that kind of stuff, and how that affected what they were going through. So as a result, they stopped helping with the census, and in 1918, they released a statistical manual, which was called the Statistical Manual for the Use of the Institutions of the Insane. So this was typically used for like asylums, inpatient facilities, stuff like that. And actually, the Bureau of the Census in 1920 used this statistical manual to make their own nomenclature of diseases. And so that's one of the big things that the APA did, or what we know now as the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, did prior to the DSM. So we know how prevalent World War II was to psychology and how it grew the field of psychology, and it brought more people into the field of psychology, specifically psychiatry. And so there were many young psychiatrists after the war that were kind of just out of a job at this point. And so they sought to actually make psychiatry on an equal level to surgery and medicine. And that ended up becoming more equal around 1944. One other big, other manual, I guess you could consider it, prior to the DSM is the ICD, which is released by the World Health Organization. I believe now they're in their 10th version of it. And so the ICD is primarily used around the world, whereas the DSM is typically really only used in America. And the APA sought to include not only hospital-driven, but also military-driven nomenclatures into the DSM-1. And this kind of shows the impact that World War II had on the initial DSM. So DSM-1, it was released in 1952. They had a formal version of it in 1950 that was accepted by the entire AP as a whole, but it wasn't actually released until 1952. It was kind of like a pamphlet, so you could just buy it anywhere. It was like $3 at the time, which if you actually think about it today, for the DSM is hundreds of dollars to get. That's really not that much for what it was. So one thing that the DSM did was it helped make psychiatry more reliable, but it still wasn't the best because, as Lexi was talking about in her presentation, they didn't have specific clinical symptoms, or they more had a general just description of things that happen in the disorder. And so one of the reasons for this is actually due to the fact that the APA felt like there were different disorders that the symptoms overlapped with each other. And so in that case, really, what does the person have? And the DSM was focused more on organic and psychotic disorders, so like personality disorders, things that were caused in the brain. So they talked a lot about brain injury, stuff like that. And it was very inpatient focused rather than outpatient. And as we know, there were 106 different disorders, ranging from neurotic disorders, psychotic disorders, and character, so that's more of like the personality, stuff like that. So kind of the effects and results of the DSM releasing is it aided in making psychiatry more reliable as a field, and helped unify diagnostic terms, but again, as I said earlier, it wasn't necessarily the greatest at the time. We know now that it's a lot better in terms of it has specific classifications that you have to fall under to actually qualify for that specific disorder. And we know now, looking back at it, that the initial DSM was very influenced by psychoanalytic theories. So this can kind of be related to how important Freud was seen as in psychology in America, because he was in America back in 1909, and the APA didn't release the DSM until 1952. It shows how societal expectations and specifically society in general affect mental illness, and so we see now that there's specific things that have changed over time because of society's view of them, such as like gender identity disorder and things like that. They're most likely still going to change in the future because of how society is going towards. And it changed psychiatric diagnoses from just somebody being an imbecile or an idiot or a moron or something like that, to more of a professional, actual, more generalizable to specific people if they fall under that specific criteria. And it also allowed for the development of outpatient treatments, because really prior to this time there wasn't a ton of outpatient treatment occurring, and so this allowed for people to actually be diagnosed with something and treated for it, but not necessarily be treated for it in an actual inpatient setting. These are my references, and any questions?
So the DSM is shifting how they update it. That's why they moved from Roman numerals to an actual number with the DSM-5. The idea is that they're going to have updates much, much quicker. Do you think that that's a good idea, given how much research time it takes to do research to update these things? Or bad, or in between? What are your thoughts?
Personally, I feel like you can't necessarily update it super quickly, but more of the updates that I feel they're trying to make are very small updates based on research that is coming out at the time, and so it doesn't necessarily have to be they release all these big individual installments, and so I feel like that's why they're doing it, and that's why they're trying to make it so they do it quicker, is because rather than having to use all this research and releasing something at one point in time, they can go and throughout time slowly make edits to it based on what's coming out at the time. Maddie?
I don't know if this question was asked, but was there anything about how long a disorder has to be studied before it's considered a disorder in the DSM?
Not in the first one. It was more just like, oh, do they have sleep apnea, or do they have this? It was not really what it is today. It was in Lexi's presentation, it was a lot more of like a general paragraph about what it was. And there's some of them that it's very like cut and dry, so some of the like depression or mania type disorders, it was very much like, oh, they have symptoms of mania, so they might not sleep as much or stuff like that. But there's others that are very kind of confused and can be seen different between different psychiatrists, just based on their interpretation of it.
And that is all the time we have.